JCMC interview series. I am Michele Introna, social media editor and neuroanesthesiologist at Istituto Best of Milano. And here today, I'm very happy because we are with Johannes Enevoldsen, who is a very young and talented researcher from Aarhus University in Denmark, who is also first author of a really nice paper that came out in the JCMC in October, which is the effects of respiratory rate and tidal volume on pulse pressure variation in healthy lungs. A generalized additive model approach may help overcome limitations. So welcome, Johannes.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for the introduction, Michele.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really a pleasure. So first of all, I would like you to tell us in brief what this study is about.
Yeah, so basically this is a study about pulse pressure variation, which is a very commonly used indicator of fluid responsiveness. And just in brief, the idea is that if you have a patient on mechanical ventilation, you can use these swings in intrathoracic pressure that the ventilator makes, because when these swings occur, it will cause swings in the filling of the heart, and these swings in filling will in turn cause variation in stroke volume and hence in pulse pressure. So if we have a patient which has a large response to these swings in ventricular filling caused by the ventilator, we may also expect that this patient will respond to a fluid bolus with an increase in stroke volume. And the clinicians use this to determine whether a patient should be given a fluid bolus or not. But then there are a number of limitations to the usefulness of this method. And in this paper, we wanted to investigate just a few of them. One of the limitations we wanted to investigate is that it has been shown that when tidal volume is low, below 8 milliliters per kilo, when it's lower than 8 milliliters per kilo, this method, pulse pressure variation, will not predict fluid responsiveness that precisely. And therefore, we wanted to know whether this is an absolute limitation or whether it's something that's more fluid, because it seemed a bit surprising that there should be just one hard cutoff, that when you're below that, it doesn't work at all, and when you're above, it works. So we wanted to know what the effect of tidal volume is on pulse pressure variation. The other limitation we wanted to address in the study is that it's also been shown that if patients have few heartbeats per respiration or a low heart rate to respiratory rate below 3.6, it's also expected that we cannot rely on pulse pressure variation. And we also wanted to investigate that limitation a bit more, understand if this is also just a hard cutoff, or if it's an effect of respiration itself, or if it's an interaction between heart rate and respiratory rate. So that was basically the idea going into this. We wanted to understand these two things. So then we designed a study where we took a number 52 patients who were scheduled for abdominal surgery, and applied a series of different ventilator settings. So both different respiratory rates from 10 to 31 respirations per minute, and also a number of different tidal volumes between 4 and 10 milliliters per kilo. And then essentially we made a protocol, and I'll just show this quickly.
Yeah, just a quick thing before you explain to us, because for podcast listeners, you can find the figures that are going to be discussed by Johannes in the below the podcast in the link space, so you can find all the images.
Yeah. So we applied these 10 different ventilator settings and applied each for 30 seconds while we recorded the arterial pressure and used this to calculate pulse pressure variation for each setting. And for each of these settings, we just show. So for each of these settings, we calculated pulse pressure variations in with two different methods. So the first method was supposed to be the classic method of calculating pulse pressure variation, which is essentially that you take 3 respirations consecutively, and for each respiration you take the highest pulse pressure in that respiration and the lowest pulse pressure, and then subtract the lowest from the highest and divide it by the mean of the 2 pressures, and that is your pulse pressure variation. Do this for 3 consecutive respirations and do the mean of these, and that is the classic method of calculating pulse pressure variation. And then we also applied a newer method where we used what is called a generalized additive model to basically decompose a series of pulse pressures into a slow trend over time, and then the respiratory variation in pulse pressure, which is what we're interested in. And the reason we did this is because we believed that the reason pulse pressure variation might not work with low heart rate to respiratory rate is that in some of these ventilations of some of these respirations, by chance we might not get a heartbeat that happens to be at the maximum effect or the minimum effect of the ventilation. So we might have one ventilation where we get a high pulse pressure variation, then the next ventilation we by chance just get a low pulse pressure variation because the 2 beats happen to appear happen to appear away from the maximum and minimum effect of the ventilation. And this may, by chance, lower the pulse pressure variation when we have low heart rate to respiratory rate. And the generalized additive model approach overcomes that problem. So we measured these 2 different types of pulse pressure variation for each of the ventilator settings. And then after we had applied all these 10 ventilator settings, we subjected the subject to a fluid challenge, 250 milliliters of saline or albumin, and then recorded the response to that fluid challenge with a pulse contour analysis. So after we applied these series of 10 different ventilator settings, we subjected the subjects to a fluid challenge with 250 milliliters of fluid, and we recorded the response to that fluid challenge using a pulse contour analysis, and deemed subjects fluid responders if they had an increase in stroke volume by above 10%. And that was basically the data we collected. Then we wanted to know whether these methods or these pulse pressures actually predicted fluid responsiveness. And unfortunately, only 10% of our patients were fluid responders. And we had quite low pulse pressure variations in this study. So that part of the of the analysis was of limited use, and there was a significant prediction of fluid responsiveness. It was better than random, but it was not good with quite wide confidence intervals. So the more interesting part of the results was how this these different tidal volumes and these different respiratory rates impacted pulse pressure variation. And we analyzed that using what is called a generalized, we analyzed that using a mixed model approach, where we wanted to know within each patient, how does a change in tidal volume or change in respiratory rate affect their pulse pressure? And the way to understand this analysis is that for each patient, we model what is the pulse pressure at 10 milliliters per kilo and 10 respirations per minute. And then we model all other effects in relation to that. And the result was that there was nearly a linear or nearly a proportional effect of changing tidal volume. So when we decreased tidal volume to 8, the PPV, the pulse pressure variation, was 80% of what it was at 10 milliliters per kilo. And when we decreased it to 6, we were down to 60%. And when we decreased it to 4, we were a bit above this proportionality, so we were down to 50%. And this was the same for both the generalized additive model approach and the classic approach. And then we also analyzed the effect of respiratory rate, which was completely independent from the effect of tidal volume, and saw that the effect on the classic method of calculating pulse pressure variation decreased quite a lot. It decreased down to 60% when the respiratory rate was 31 compared to 10. Whereas the generalized additive model approach only decreased down to 60%, down to 80% compared to at 10 milliliters. No. So the generalized additive model approach only decreased down to 80% compared to a respiratory rate of 10. And that completely falls in line with our expectation that the classic approach to calculating pulse pressure variation falls short when we have high respiratory rates. Yeah, so essentially what we concluded with this study is that the problem with using low heart rate to respiratory rate seems to be mostly a methodological problem, that with the technique used to measure pulse pressure variation, and not a physiological problem due to some interaction between respiration and heart rate, because we do not see the same drop in pulse pressure variation with the generalized additive model approach. Also, we see that with lowering tidal volume, we have this proportional drop in pulse pressure variation, which suggests that we should probably use a lower threshold for pulse pressure variation for predicting fluid responsiveness if the tidal volume is lower. Unfortunately, we could not predict fluid responsiveness with this study because we generally had non-fluid responsive patients. So it might be that there is some other reason that pulse pressure variation does not work with low tidal volume or low heart rate to respiratory rate that we could not investigate in this study. But we were able to find these quite strong and quite striking effects of tidal volume and respiratory rate.
This is really interesting, given to me as an anesthesiologist, it's really interesting because it's always a matter how parameters are calculated. We always do not think, when we are using as clinicians the tools that we are given to measure outcomes during the operation, for example, we tend not to think on what's inside the algorithms that calculate the numbers we use. And this is a clear example on two methods confronted. So it's really fascinating to me to see this process ongoing with someone, an expert, explaining it to us. So the question I have now is, do you foresee a widespread use of generalized additive models, or there is still work to do?
So I think we are quite far away from actually implementing generalized additive models into anesthesiology monitors. Both because they are computationally quite expensive to implement, and also because there might be simpler ways of getting this respiratory effect out of a series of pulse pressures. The reason we use the generalized additive model here is that it's very robust. We can see that these effects are quite strong. There's very little noise around these models, so we believe that we actually see true physiology with these models. So we use this as we think that we have a quite strong argument that we can extract pulse pressure variation with low heart rate to respiratory rate ratio, but it might not be the only way to do it.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, really interesting. I was also interested in, did you encounter any specific challenges during your study? Anything that you had to deal with?
Yeah, we of course encountered plenty of challenges. So just technically, with recording all this data, we had to record data from both the ventilator and from the cardiac output monitor and from the blood pressure monitor. So that was quite a challenge to get all that working. We also had a challenge with that we wanted to record this fluid response. We wanted to do this in patients who are both fluid responsive and some who are non-responsive, to get a wide range of pulse pressure variations. But because we applied quite a large number of different ventilator settings for 30 seconds each, it took quite some time to do that. And that gave us the problem that if patients were actually hemodynamically unstable and really required this fluid, it would not be safe to do a 10-minute series of ventilator settings before the fluid was given. So therefore, we probably ended up with quite stable patients in this study.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fascinating, and I'm so proud that I'm part of a journal that shares this kind of knowledge. I'm afraid our time is running out. So thank you, Johannes. Thank you really, really much. It was such a pleasure to have you here in JMC interview series.
Thank you, Mikkel. Thank you, Mikkel, and thank you for inviting me.
I always remember to all the listeners to subscribe to our channels on YouTube, Amazon Prime, Google Podcasts, Spotify, to increase the number of followers and to give us the chance of providing you with more and more contents. So thank you, and see you soon.